All right, welcome everybody. It's really a privilege to be with you today. I'm Steve Payne. I'm Dean of the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on faith perspectives on business accountability for human rights. This is the penultimate event in a series of programs focusing on business and human rights. The series will culminate on April 7th this year with a conference on business accountability for human rights, addressing human rights issues in global supply chains. That conference, organized by our school, the Columbus School of Law, in collaboration with Paul Hastings LLP, will take place here in Washington, D.C. on April 7th and 8th, 2022. We hope our upcoming conference, together with these online programs, will enable individuals and organizations ways to recognize how the private and public sectors, people in the academy and in faith traditions can work together for a better future for those who are most vulnerable in our global economy. We're delighted that you're with us today. Our earlier programs have focused on an overview of the plight of those caught up in the web of modern day slavery and human trafficking, and considered topics ranging from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on supply chain workers to human rights issues for small businesses, to the steps global companies are taking to address human rights issues in their supply chains. Today, we will hear from 4 experts on faith perspectives on business accountability for human rights issues in the global supply chain. Our moderators are Ms. Renata Parras and Professor Sarah Duggan. Ms. Parras is the Global Pro Bono Counsel of Paul Hastings LLP. She is deeply engaged in business and human rights issues at the law firm, as well as in her earlier work with the United States government. Professor Duggan is a member of our faculty, director of our Compliance Investigations and Corporate Responsibility Program, and a former corporate general counsel. She's also an Episcopal priest. So thank you for joining us today. And Sarah, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dean Payne, and welcome everyone. As Dean Payne said, we're delighted to offer this program, and it's a joy to do so in collaborations with Paul Hastings LLP. We're particularly grateful to Tara Junta, a CUA alum and vice chair of the firm's investigations and white-collar defense practice, and to my co-moderator, Renata Parras, who, as Dean Payne noted, is the firm's global pro bono counsel. Thanks to the CUA team who've helped so much to promote all of these programs and put them together, including Constantia Dedulis, Joe Ferraro, Jillian Salasso, and Al Washington, who's at the Zoom helm for today's program. Thank you all. As we noted when we first began this series, the United Nations estimates that tens of millions of people around the world are ensnared in the chains of modern-day slavery. Too often, we fail to make the connections between our lives, our work, and the millions of people who suffer to bring us the goods we take for granted. This reality raises profound moral and ethical questions, particularly from a faith perspective, but also from the perspective of anyone who is a person of good faith. As the United Nations and governments throughout the world have recognized, faith is critically important to hundreds of millions of people, and religious entities and their affiliates often play vital roles in humanitarian responses to the plight of those who are poorest and most vulnerable. Just 2 days ago, Pope Francis observed on the feast of St. Josephine Bakhita, all people of good faith can and must fight to ensure that the dignity of every person is recognized, with special attention to those whose fundamental rights have been violated. Faith traditions have a great deal to contribute to the dialogue on business accountability for human rights, particularly with respect to the ethical questions at the heart of the issue. The roles of people of good faith who work in business, as well as consumers of the products that come to us through global supply chains. And to what extent religious traditions and religiously affiliated organizations play a role in helping us all to understand and act on issues of business accountability for human rights. Today, we're honored, as Dean Payne said, to have wonderful experts from faith traditions who are deeply engaged in different ways in the subject of business accountability for human rights. My colleague Renata Parras will introduce our distinguished guests. Renata?
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you again, Dean Payne, for having me on today's panel. As Sarah said, I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists today. The first of the panelists is Mary Graw-Leary, who is Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor at Cool Law at the Catholic University of America's Columbus School of Law. A former prosecutor and Deputy Director of the Office of Legal Counsel for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, as well as former Director of the National Center for the Prevention of Child Abuse, Dean Graw-Leary's scholarship focuses on issues at the intersection of criminal law and procedure with technology and contemporary victimization, particularly with respect to women and children. She has written extensively in these areas, and she is a recognized expert in exploitation and human trafficking. Dean Graw-Leary has worked with the Roman Catholic Church, the Catholic University of America, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the Vatican on issues pertaining to human trafficking, modern-day slavery, and victim assistance. In addition to her other writings, Dean Graw-Leary has published several articles pertaining to the role of churches in addressing these issues. Dean Graw-Leary holds a BA with honors from Georgetown University and a JD from Georgetown University Law School. Also joining us today as a panelist is the Reverend Leanne Rhodes, who is an ordained minister of the Australian Christian Churches and the Executive Director of the European Freedom Network, an anti-trafficking network with over 260 organizations from 44 countries, and Global Director of the World Evangelical Alliance's World Freedom Network. Reverend Rhodes has worked in community development programs in Australia, Thailand, Cambodia, Africa, and India, and helped address human issues ranging from homelessness to clean water and human trafficking. He holds a degree in information technology from Queensland University of Technology and a graduate diploma of theology from Harvest Bible College. Reverend Rhodes travels regularly across Europe to work with churches, governments, and NGOs in the prevention of human trafficking, and she's joining us today from Portugal. A very special thanks to Reverend Rhodes for joining us very late. Her time is currently 10 p.m. Our other panelist, the Reverend David Schilling, is a United Methodist clergy member and program director for the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. Reverend Schilling has worked with ICCR members and allies since 1994 to engage businesses and business people in a cross-sectoral and multi-stakeholder initiatives on human rights in corporate operations and global supply chains. Reverend Schilling has authored guides to supply chain accountability for investors and businesses. He chairs the advisory board of the Global Social Compliance Program, serves on the steering committees of the Responsible Labor Initiative of the Responsible Business Alliance, the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment, and the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur Region. He is a member of the UN Global Compact Expert Network. Reverend Schilling holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy and religion from Carroll College in Wisconsin and a master's of divinity from Union Theological Seminary. He is a graduate of Columbia University's International Fellows Program, Columbia University, and has an advanced professional studies certificate from the Pacific School of Religion. Our last panelist, who unfortunately could not be here today due to a death in his family, was Dr. Abdulaziz Sachedina, who is professor and International Institute of Islamic Thought Chair in Islamic Studies at the George Mason University, and is a noted Islamic scholar and business ethicist. Our thoughts and prayers go out to Professor Sachedina and his family today. We will begin our program with brief overviews from each of our panelists and then turn to discussion questions. The final segment of our program will be devoted to questions from all of you joining us today. We will be using the Q&A tool rather than the chat function for questions. As we begin, please open your Q&A function on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen so that you're ready to write in the Q&A bar, and I will be monitoring that bar for you, Sarah. I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah.
Thanks very much, Renata. We'd like to begin with brief opening remarks from our panelists, and they're going to be addressing many different topics, but I think it would be wonderful if we could ask each of you to express a few thoughts on the topics of business accountability for human rights, and particularly to avoid modern day slavery and human trafficking of global supply chains. Reverend Schilling, may I ask you to begin?
Well, thank you so much. And it's really important, the work that you're doing, and the seminars, the conference coming up, incredibly timely. Too many humans are in situations of forced labor, bonded labor, having been trafficked into what they would consider a kind of a slave-like situation. However, when they were recruited, they were assuming that it would be a living wage, that they would be treated with dignity. So the global supply chain focus is really, really critical, because it literally millions and millions of people that are making products that you and I use every day, whether it's clothing or a cell phone. It connects us to global supply chains in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, in Latin America, and in Africa, in the Middle East, where often there are conditions, particularly foreign migrant workers, women, children, are highly vulnerable or made vulnerable by economic systems, by racism, by sexism, by a whole range of factors that make it more likely that they could easily be exploited. So in this kind of context, the more that we think about the kind of resources that faith has to do long-term work in this arena, it's not like any of us that have done this work know that it's not like you do for a day or a week or a month or a year. Tremendous progress. There is progress. However, it's often slow, and in part, the global supply chain is based on certain principles where power usually is in the hands of the retailers and brands that are actually making the contracts with suppliers all over the world. And so suppliers, particularly small businesses that are operating in a number of different contexts, some of them very difficult, and workers and their communities have really been suffering. So I think if COVID taught us anything, it is that the total system of global supply chains and moving work to a variety of different areas, almost like a race to the bottom where low wages are paid or they're not paid. And so I've been in this work for almost 28 years. I joined the staff of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility in 1994. We're celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, last year and this year. And we started in 1971. Initially, it was Protestant denominations and the National Council of Churches in the US. Then within a couple of years, Catholic orders, Catholic dioceses, Catholic healthcare systems joined the ICCR, and then some funds from the Jewish community and more recently from the Muslim community, all banding together to utilize their role as shareholders in all the companies that you can name. And as a result of the model that we use, our members own shares, they're part owners of the company. And so we can file under US, the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, shareholder resolutions. That is a one way to hold companies accountable. That they're resolutions, 500 words, that are legal documents, although they're non-binding, and all the shareholders vote on resolutions. So the first one that ICCR filed in May of 1971, all of a sudden at the General Motors annual shareholder meeting in Detroit, there were all these religious people and they had filed a resolution. It was on the ballot, and you could just see in the faces of the board and the staff, why are these people here? And they're talking about human rights. They're asking us as a company to withdraw from South Africa because of this apartheid system. What is this? Ought to be governments that take care of this, not companies. So the interesting thing is that in 1971, it was the first time a social resolution was filed with a company, and they just looked like you shouldn't be here. 16 years later, they withdrew from South Africa. It wasn't just our engagement. Our engagement was tied to South Africans. A young minister of the South African Council of Churches had contacted ICCR to utilize its shares to get companies to withdraw. And that young minister turned out to be Desmond Tutu, who, was a joy to work with through the years, and unfortunately died, just in the last 4 weeks. But we really look to learn from people on the ground, and then take those messages to companies, to hold companies accountable to principles, to ethical behavior, and to listen to their own stakeholders, not just shareholders, but to stakeholders who are human beings that are often caught in the crossfire of human trafficking and modern slavery.
Thank you very much, David. Leanne, may I ask you, Reverend Rhodes, could you go ahead?
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you so much, Dean Payne, Ms. Perez, and Professor Duggan, for the invitation to be here. It's certainly an honour to be on a panel as distinguished as this. About a year ago, I caught an Uber. I'm in Portugal, and I caught an Uber here, and I met a driver named Pravin. We started talking, and I found out that he was from India and had come to Portugal to find a better life and send support money back to his family. I asked him when he first came, and soon discovered that his first job here in Portugal was in agriculture. I asked him what the working conditions were like, and he said it was terrible. There were 120 men there, and they were all living in shipping containers. There was one bathroom for all of them and one kitchen. The employer charged them for rent, for living in those shipping containers that got swelteringly hot in summer, and charged the employees whenever he drove them to town to buy groceries. Of course, they relied on the employer to drive them to town because they were in the middle of nowhere. Payment was irregular and without the necessary pay slips that they needed to get residency here in Portugal. So they were stuck in this cycle. They had a job that was sort of paying money, but not giving them what they expected to be able to get out of the situation. At the same time, overtime was expected and unpaid for, and anyone who complained was told that they had to leave. Of course, that wasn't an option because they were in the middle of nowhere, didn't speak the language, didn't know how to find their way around. It is for people like Pravin that we must ensure that there is business accountability in human rights. We, as people of faith, must work to make sure that our own supply chains are slavery-free, and that we work to help business understand that a world where people treat each other fairly is possible. Just 2 days ago here in Europe, more than 100 companies and investors called for effective EU corporate accountability legislation. That's right, it was the businesses wanting reform. Companies like IKEA, Ericsson and Epson, and even chocolate companies like Goulian and Latlia. There are businesses that want to do the right thing, but they also want to ensure that their business is not disadvantaged by doing so. They have called for all businesses to be held accountable and not just those of a certain size. Over here in Europe, we're on a precipice of legislation going through, and at the moment it's been denied twice, and this is a call of businesses saying, no, we want business accountability. So that's a really good part of the conversation to concentrate on. But we must not forget that human rights and corporate accountability exists not just in supply chains and forced or exploitative labour, but also in sexual exploitation. It exists in how companies spend their money. We call for business to develop zero tolerance policies and procedures around use of prostitution or pornography on travel trips and in entertainment budgets. People caught in prostitution are often trafficked, and their human rights matter too. And that's another part of corporate accountability that we can speak to. As people of faith and as organisations of faith, we must also take a look at our own expenditure and policies and procedures. We must make sure that our own supply chains, the cleaners that clean our churches, or the people that make our choir uniforms, or the catering firms that are catering our events, we must make sure that they are slavery-free. Churches run schools, hospitals, and many of the institutions in the world. It is on us also to make sure that we are not inadvertently engaging in slavery. To engage in this conversation effectively, people of faith need to speak the language of business. Businesses are made up of people, many of them good people, many of them people of faith. Let's engage in dialogue with them and with the province of this world, as well as taking a look at ourselves to see this potential paradigm shift come into fruition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Rhodes. Dean Graw-Leary.
Thank you so much, Professor Duggan. Thank you to all my fellow panelists for sharing their expertise, as well as all of you who are taking time out of your days to listen to this webinar. I'm especially grateful to CICR and Paul Hastings for joining Catholic University and Professor Duggan in these efforts. I was asked here because, as Professor Duggan indicated, I've previously written about how religious organizations, religiously affiliated organizations, can be effective partners with governments in combating trafficking. And many governments don't really see them as an obvious stakeholder. So I've written about how there's a natural connection there in this space. Let me explain what I mean by that a little bit. As Reverend Schilling pointed out earlier, the paradox, as I like to put it, of forced labor or of modern day slavery is it is both global and local. And what I mean by that is one of the reasons it's so particularly pernicious to combat is it's global. It doesn't limit itself to geopolitical boundaries. So for those trying to combat it, we run into these struggles where recruitment happen in one country sometimes, the trafficking in another, the victim survivors are transient, etc. Lots of obstacles like that. So global in its impact. And again, to echo Reverend Schilling's points, global in the product in our hands might have been through 3, 4, 5 different countries before it reached us, or even more. But it's also local. Effective traffickers and recruiters know their local communities. They know the vulnerabilities. Ultimately, modern day slavery is about a power imbalance. It is about exploiting the vulnerabilities, what we call the push factors in modern day slavery, and knowing what those vulnerabilities are, which are often not only economic, but cultural, geographical, gender-based, etc. When recruiters and traffickers and those engaged in modern day slavery know that, there's a local component, which means that our response to modern day slavery can't be cookie cutter. While there are common causes, there are real local attributes which require us to be nimble in that response. And as I used to say before I started conversing with Professor Duggan, I would say we need a global and local response. And who is that? And I'd say it's religions. Religions and religious affiliated organizations have both that global reach, whether it's through their networks or churches like the Roman Catholic Church, which are global in many respects, but also local. These are the groups that have been working with the most marginalized, the most vulnerable throughout the world. But my good friend, Professor Duggan, corrected me once when I said this and said, and global corporations. And she's quite right. And so tonight, what I'm hoping as we engage in our discussion to talk about is that partnership is equally as important between these global and local religions and religiously affiliated organizations and these global corporations in order to combat trafficking. In the year 2000, that was a watershed year for our addressing modern day slavery and human trafficking with the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act here in the United States, or the Palermo Protocol beginning globally. But for religions and religious organizations, they've been working with these populations for decades, if not centuries beforehand. And as corporations do try to, as Reverend Rhodes said, do try to do the right thing, a natural partner, but not one that comes to mind, are these religions and religiously affiliated organizations right there on the front lines as people representing and working with victim survivors. So as we go through our discussions tonight, I've got some specific examples, but that's really the framework I think that's important in this discussion. We don't naturally think to link corporate America with religions and religious organizations, but this is a natural partnership which can produce, in my view, really excellent results.
Thanks very much, Dean Grau-Leary, and thanks to all of you. Let's turn to some specific questions as we go forward, and we'll ask various speakers to members of our panel to take the lead on some of these questions. But let's start with, for just a few minutes, on the problem itself. Individuals and organizations around the world, whether it's governments, the United Nations, NGOs, business leaders themselves, have called for an end to human rights abuses in global supply chains. And Reverend Rhodes gave us a great example of that happening recently in Europe. And many religious leaders and religiously affiliated organizations are working hard to eliminate the horrors of labor exploitation in supply chains. But why then are these problems so pervasive and so persistent? And Reverend Schilling, you spoke about progress, but slow progress. What's going on there? Why, when we all recognize these problems, are they so very hard to address? Reverend Schilling, may I ask you to start with that? I think you're still muted.
The pervasiveness is there because of a number of reasons. I always think about the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals, and look at a range of areas that we as a global community want to make progress on to 2030. One of them is, of course, the one that I really focus on the most, perhaps, although they're all interrelated, is the Sustainable Development Goal 8 of decent work, and underneath that really calls out forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, and has some indicators. That is kind of getting the sort of the global community's agenda into a lot of different institutions. However, it's working against, like so many countries that I've visited, where there's extreme poverty, where there is a denial of sort of basic rights of women, where children are seen as exploitable. So I think there's the pervasiveness that is, on the one hand, social economic, and on the other hand, if we look at the way the global supply chain has evolved. When I first started, it was in the early 90s, and there wasn't as much offshore outsourcing. But now you see so many different communities around the globe that, like Coca-Cola is in every country, more countries than are in the UN. And I think only the example of North Korea is one, but they have a tremendous footprint in a lot of these areas, and within that company that we know well and have engaged since the 70s on a range of issues, and now on human trafficking, human rights issues, they have within their structure a lot of different needs and interests, and one of them, of course, is to continue to get the profit from the product. I think it's possible to do that ethically. But there's a huge tension there. And I think as the global supply chain we now know, it's so pervasive, is one that is buyer driven, as I said earlier, a commodity chain where power is really at the top. And I think what I find exciting is more the progress around worker-driven social responsibility that is made more community-based, worker-based. But we need to get, we can't sort of isolate the global supply chain just as an economic operation, but it really impacts people's livelihood, life, dignity. And as a result, we're not talking about a few things we tweak. It's the system itself that needs to change. And Mary, as you were talking about just the discrepancies of power. So I hope that the pandemic has awakened all of us to the responsibilities of, the current system is broken. And a number of companies are working to really try to get a more equitable, flexible supply chain that will meet their needs. And of course, there are lots of issues in the headlines about the lack of, the delivery of products to different, especially Europe and the US. But I think this is an ethical issue. It's a moral issue. It's a human rights issue. And I feel like it's the principles that we bring, but also we should take real advantage of like the Sustainable Development Goals because it's comprehensive. It deals with gender. It deals with children. It deals with the economy. It deals with decent work. So I think there's a lot to build on.
Great, thank you so much. Reverend Rhodes or Dean Graw-Leary, do you have anything you'd like to add to that, or perhaps comment on the unique or special perspectives and capabilities that people of faith, especially religious leaders and religious organizations, can bring to the effort to eliminate these horrors in global supply chains? And you both addressed that a little bit, but I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit more on that. Reverend Rhodes, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I wanted to say that we need to work as people of faith to create a public level of disgust that this is going on. There aren't enough people. My friend Kevin Hyland, who's the former anti-trafficking commissioner for the UK, he likes to say that there's no public disgust on this, and I think that's something with as people of faith in our churches, in our congregations, in the places where we meet, we can help people to realize that this is an issue that we need to deal with. I think another dynamic that's going on, because this is a global problem, I know the economist Jeffrey Sachs talks about the people that you don't see. And this is definitely something we often talk about human trafficking as it's hidden in plain sight. We don't see it. And so therefore we don't tend to move into action for people that we don't see. And a lot of the response when it comes to global supply chains is things happening in another country somewhere else related to what we're buying over here, and we don't see the connection. And I think as people of faith, we need to start speaking about theologies of like, who is our neighbor? Is it the person in India or in Asia in the clothing factory? Is it those people? And just to start building up that we are global citizens and that our choices impact other people, and to actually care about that.
Thanks very much. Dean Graw-Leary?
Thanks. So Professor Duggan, well, the first part of your question was sort of why does it persist? And I think in a perhaps an overly simplistic answer to that is modern day slavery is something that is low risk that a corporation will feel any punishment, whether that is harm to reputation or actual legal punishment, and high profit for the direct traffickers, or high money saved, well worth the money for those who benefit from it. And that's really something that's got to switch. And Reverend Rhodes talked about sort of ways we can make that switch with the consumer disgust or public disgust. But that brings me to the second part of your question, which is what are some capabilities, perspectives from faith-based? I would say there's a lot of capabilities from religion and religious communities, one of which I mentioned is the people at risk. They have been served by often religion and religiously affiliated. They're working in those populations. Now, I should say from the outset, I do understand that religion and religiously affiliated groups have also contributed to modern day slavery. I want to be clear that our hands are not clean, and there's no question about that. But today, in addition to the dirty hands that we all have, they're working with the very groups at risk. And so they can be a trusted voice for corporations as they realize these are the people who are going to be working for them. Maybe it's down the supply chain. But if you really want your supply chain to be clean, who can you go to find out what's really happening on the ground? And often it's these sorts of groups. And in many of these communities, the religious organizations are the de facto social services, are the de facto governments even. And so they can be a very trusted intermediary between the potential workforce and the group at risk and the group who needs prevention training, etc., and the corporations who we will hope don't want to be associated with modern day slavery. But I think the last part of your question, Professor Duggan, touched on perspectives. And I'd like to say that in our anti-modern slavery movement, I think we're at point 2.0. And by that, I mean 20 years after the Palermo Protocol and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and other legislation in other countries, we've kind of done I don't want to say the easy work, but the easier work. Most countries have laws in place. Most countries have, we have a number of international documents or business accords with standards, etc. We're now at the point, though, where it's going to hurt. And everybody has to understand if you really want to end modern day slavery, there's a cost. There's a cost to profits for corporations, and they just have to accept that as a cost of doing business. And that globalization doesn't just mean maximizing profits. It means also sometimes taking measures you didn't have to take before. And for the consumer as well. If we really don't want modern day slavery, then as consumers, if we can, we might have to accept higher prices, let's say, or alternative situations, or not purchasing items we really think are important, but we know are part of this problem. So I think that that's the perspective that people of faith and religious affiliated organizations and religions can bring to this discussion, that we're at a place, if we're serious about ending modern day slavery, we have to be willing to understand we have to pay a little bit in order to make that happen.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. Let's talk just for a moment about theological or faith perspectives. In what ways does faith, and I talk about various traditions, but from your own tradition, as a matter of theology or good practice, call upon business people to be accountable for human rights abuses, particularly with respect to labor exploitation? Reverend Rhodes, would you like to address that?
Sure. Yeah, so I think one of the things that we're looking at in the European Freedom Network, so we're a body of anti-trafficking specialists, so we're the service providers that are working with people that have been trafficked. So, for example, in 2019, our members served over 3,000 survivors in that year. So we have in our midst a lot of expertise. And I think one of the things that we as a faith community can do is, and I know many faith communities have organized groups like Renata and so on. One of the things that we can do is help businesses get ready for when these laws come in place. And I think that's something that we can do. So we can be offering, okay, this is coming. What corporations are busy going, we don't know what to do about this. We don't know how to identify slavery in our supply chains. And then if we find it, we don't know what to do. And I think this is a special case that the faith community has to contribute to this conversation, like Professor Graw-Leary said. And we're certainly working in EFN and the World Freedom Network to build that infrastructure ready so that I predict a couple of years when these laws come in place, particularly in the EU, that we're ready and positioned to be people of answers in this, to come alongside and help make this a reality and work it out.
Thank you very much. Reverend Schilling, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, at this point, I'm not sure. I do feel like the whole question of principled approach that is informed by faith traditions. And I think to some degree, the engagement, we're meeting with companies all of the time, and the language that we use isn't necessarily theological, but it's informed by theology. And what we find out is that there are people in the corporation that have a deep faith. There's a CEO of a major company where ICCR members, faith-based members, had been really engaging since the late 80s. And it was hard work. But as a new CEO came in with a strong faith, all of a sudden, a lot of the things that we were putting forth in terms of like the company really taking seriously the human rights of workers, women, children out of the workplace, what to do to really address child labor, became much more prominent. So the language, then sometimes it's an email back and forth with a CEO that can help shape his or her understanding. And in one case, in 2016, after a long focus on foreign migrant workers, unethical recruitment, the CEO really put all of that into the strategic plan going forward for the next 5 years. And I don't think that would have happened with just if we hadn't had a deep faith and the trust level was there. And there's an interrelationship, I think, between people of faith, not all the time, but we aspire to really seeing the dignity in every person, including a CEO. And so, working to get that company to look at the most vulnerable people in their global supply chain and in their operations. And without that sort of faith understanding that created a different table, if you will, over time, I don't think the progress on very tangible things about really putting energy and effort into responsible supply chain management, but to do it from starting with the human point of view and not the profit point of view.
Thanks very much. Dean Graw-Leary, I wonder if I could ask you to start with a kind of a two-part question here. First, there's the idea that businesses need incentives to do things, and their ethical and moral teachings. There's the idea of doing the right thing. What incentives do business and business people have to engage in significant efforts to address human rights? And by the same token, given that businesses often oppose regulation, not always, but often, is the role of people of faith to call upon governments to enact and businesses to accept more regulation? So whichever part you would like, if you could just give us some enlightenment on that.
Well, with this panel, I'm not in charge of enlightenment. I leave that to all of you. But I'm a lawyer, so I'm happy to answer on all of it. I think that it's really, I think we have to consider our opposition to modern day slavery. It's a global movement, right? It's a social movement. We're asking people to think differently than they have in the past, etc. And I've done a little bit of work as putting on my criminal law hat as a criminal law professor, looking at what are the social movements that stick around when it comes to that interface between sort of criminal activity and the law, and ones that don't. And I think we certainly can't criminalize our way out of modern day slavery, right? Just making it illegal isn't going to do enough for all the reasons that we've talked about: the globalization, the distance in supply chains, etc. Regulation is, I think, a component, but that alone isn't enough. And I think when we look at successful movements in this space, from what I've been able to see, there are three components to them. First, there are legal changes. Sometimes the law moves first and society catches up, but sometimes society moves and the law catches up. It goes either way. So I do think there has to be changes in the laws, changes in regulations, accountability. I think that's an important component. But also there has to be stigma. And this was, I think, Dr. Rhodes's point. So it has to not be acceptable to engage in the behavior that we want. Now, in the business world, I guess we're talking about sort of reputational or marketplace damage, okay? But the same idea that it is frowned upon, that it looks bad if Volkswagen, you've lied about your environmental record. It looks bad if you have certain things going on in your workplace. That will turn investors or consumers off. And the third thing we need, which might be a precursor to the first two, is education. Education for everybody, but I think of particular use is education about the harms, the actual human harms that are being caused by engaging in this activity, as well as education for people at risk of being brought into exploitative labor, for the consumer, etc. And if I could just give an example, it's not a great business example, but I think it's a really good example of what I'm talking about. If you think about here in the United States, how we turned in a matter of about 2 decades with regard to drunk driving, which doesn't seem like there's an analogy, but hear me out. Before our drunk driving laws, it was socially acceptable to drink, socially acceptable to drive. There was resistance if there was any movement for any sort of regulation laws, etc. The whole movement really took off with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, who stigmatized that by educating policymakers and the public about the real harm of that criminal behavior. The laws then followed, breathalyzer tests, mandatory minimums, etc. And then went the stigma. And so now today, something that was socially acceptable a few decades earlier, now today it's illegal, everyone is comfortable with it, and it's really stigmatized. There is harm to somebody, reputational harm, if they were to engage in that behavior. And those are the three components that I think we need in this space as well. It's got to not be profitable for a company to have modern day slavery in their workplace or in their supply chains. It's got to be a big deal, it's got to be a level of disgust, as Dr. Rhodes said. And we have to educate, and the way we get there is for people to see the faces and the realities of things like debt bondage, unsafe working conditions, child labor, etc.
Thank you very much.
Maybe Sarah, could I add
Please.
a couple of other tools here? I mean, the first is we found that the lever of real change needs to include regulation. So what we have been doing, along with a whole range of others, particularly related to the forced labor of Uyghur people in the Xinjiang province of China. It's not just forced labor, it's a whole host of human rights abuses, including internment in camps against their will. So we've helped, along with a whole number of organizations, put together this End Uyghur, forced labor in the Uyghur region. It has probably 80 Uyghur groups from around the world, trade unions, people of faith, investors, some companies as well. And this essentially was really important to get the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed this past year and then signed by President Biden, which really is critical because it's a tool that really gets at the sort of the forced labor from the point of view of what can come into the country. So in 1935, the Tariff Act had a provision that essentially said no product that is made by forced labor would come into the country. There was also a kind of a caveat, a consumptive demand, which meant that if consumers in the US really needed it and couldn't get it elsewhere, then it could come in, which is obviously very hypocritical. President Obama, changed that loophole. And now with the Prevention Act, and then ICCR submitted along with 10 other human trafficking and anti sort of forced labor groups to the Custom and Border Protection, CBP, to request a withhold release order, meaning that the whole area of Xinjiang, nothing could come in to the country if a release order was put on that, so that it would get to the border and then there would be sufficient evidence to keep it out. So they finally did that actually. We submitted it in August of 2019, and that has moved companies tremendously. So we've been engaging companies, but also those levers are huge. When the act is passed, companies need to abide by it, and this withhold release order now is in place with all the products, the cotton coming from Xinjiang that gets into the apparel sector especially. So I think it's a combination of like active engagement of companies, but utilizing, as you were describing, Mary, some of the tools that are there in terms of regulation that moves the needle across the board.
Great. Thank you very much. I think you told us a little bit about what you've learned from working in this space. And I wonder if, Reverend Rhodes, you might want to comment in addition about some of the best ways for religious entities or affiliated organizations to work with businesses or governments and NGOs in trying to work on these issues of human trafficking and modern day slavery and global supply chains.
Yeah, sure. Again, as I said before, we're definitely working on ourselves as the church. So we are very connected to the World Evangelical Alliance, European Evangelical Alliance. So we're using those connections to help the church be an example in this, and it makes sure that, as Dean Gore-Leary said, that we're recognizing the mistakes that we have made as the church and making sure that the church itself, because if you think about it, in the World Evangelical Alliance, there's an estimated 600 million Christians represented there. So that's a huge part of purchasing power. And if you then think about, well, there's 600 million people in church, then how many churches are there? And each of those churches are an organization. And then if we can help all of those church organizations to make sure that they are slavery free and that they've checked their supply chains, that can have a huge impact across the world. So that's definitely one thing that we're looking at with the World Freedom Network, is how can we equip the wider church to do that, but then also then taking everything that we've learned from that and speaking to the businesses. Again, business people are in our churches, business people are in our faith traditions, and we can speak to them. And also there's the benefit of that they are usually the people on the church boards as well. So by working with the church, we're actually educating a whole lot of business people about this and helping them to understand. So then we hope the knock-on effect for that is to work with the corporate world. And then certainly as a leader of a network that works particularly with NGOs that are combating human trafficking. We're working on helping all of those organizations to become very conversant in due diligence, supply chain, and corporate accountability. So we know when laws come in, and particularly we're on the precipice of something in Europe, like Germany's just implemented laws, other countries in Europe are discussing it, and it's a very current conversation over here in Europe. So we're working on making sure that all of the organizations that we work with are very conversant on this issue, so that when the corporates come knocking and go, we don't know what we're doing, we're ready for it. So we're gearing up in those ways.
Thank you so much. And there's so much further we could go with all of this, but I want to leave some time for audience questions. But I'd like to ask you each a final question before we turn to our audience questions. What can people of goodwill do to promote business accountability for human rights and to help with the struggle to eliminate human rights abuses in global supply chains? Mary or David, would you like to start?
Well, there's so many things that can be done, but they have to start with community. You have to be working not just alone, but if you have an opportunity. Students are organizing around these issues. In the late 90s, with the anti-sweatshop movement in this country, students started to, draw the line between the sort of the invisible worker and the visible product that was being sold in university stores, logoed material that was made under, sweatshop conditions, forced labor in instances, and a number of organizations emerged, one of which I was involved with, the Fair Labor Association, that came out of the work that we did around the White House Apparel Industry Partnership to really get at this. I think it's really important, to look at it from the consumer point of view. There are so many, like, for example, Know the Chain, a really credible benchmarking of companies in apparel, footwear, in food, in electronics, et cetera. And they're looking at forced labor. They're rating companies. How does a company deal with workers, worker voice, engagement of workers, agency of workers? What about fair recruitment? What about purchasing practices? Because sometimes the company's policies really put pressure on the supplier, because for example, in the apparel, design changes at the last minute. And guess what? Workers have to work double time and under unsafe conditions. So I do feel like there's a tremendous amount. Investors, I look at, like, for example, Catholic University, some $275 million in its endowment. I worry about, is there any investment that is in publicly traded companies that is intersecting with modern slavery? So there are ways that we can look at, where do we have some leverage and how does it intersect with me? And I want to do something that this is a photo. I don't know if you can see it, but this is a worker and myself. This was at a global forum around issues related to trafficking and slavery. And this young man spent 16 years on a ship. He went from Myanmar to Thailand and then was finally sold to a ship owner that, out to sea, the ship would come into port and the fish would be offloaded. The guards kept the workers on the ship. 16 years. So I have this on my bulletin board because I think one of the things that happens is, there's no way that that workers can be invisible when you've seen a man like this who has been through terrible conditions. Now he is a survivor that is actually a leader. He doesn't want anyone else to go through this thing. So I think there are ways that we can connect our own, but it's better if we work with others to accomplish specific goals in this arena, because it's a long it's a long-term commitment.
Thank you so much. Just quickly, because we need to turn to audience questions, but Mary or Leanne, would you like to add anything else there?
I could just say something sort of more generally, and that is, I think we have to learn from history. Those of us here in the United States, when we learn about antebellum slavery, I think to ourselves, or I think many of us do, gosh, that was terrible. How could that have been okay? How could in America people have walked past a place where another human being was being sold and thought that was okay? That's crazy. I'm sure glad I didn't live then, because I would have been so enlightened. Well, there are more people enslaved today than there were at the height of the mid-19th century transatlantic slave trade. We are living in that society, and therefore we have to, as people of good faith, recognize we are those people. And so what are we doing? Because if we are not standing up for those workers, fighting those things, accepting the costs of not having cheap products, accepting the stigma when you say, hey, I'm going to get rid of this product because it's tied to labor, as Reverend Schilling said, we are those people who are benefiting from slavery. And we don't want to be those people. And we don't want our grandchildren to ask us, how was it that we could have let this happen?
That's well said. Thank you. Leanne, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, each of us are not innocent in this. We all have our own power in this. Like we all have our own individual purchasing power. Like we may not run a company, but we can choose which companies we buy from. And we can ask them. I think it's great when you're buying something from a company, like ask, you know, where was this sourced? Is there slavery in this clothing? Check it out and start getting the conversation out there. And then businesses start talking about it. If you think about environmental issues, it's because 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people were asking lots of questions of the companies. And now it's a trend that's changed and has become very important. And businesses like Apple are taking note. Like I noticed in one of their keynote speeches at the end of last year, every new product, they had an explanation of the sustainability that they went to in regards to the environment. I think, wouldn't it be wonderful if next year they also had a slide on the human rights impact? That would be wonderful. But that only comes because we're asking the questions of the people that we buy things from.
Mhm.
Thank you so much. I'd like to go back to my colleague, Ms. Praz, and ask you, would you like to give us some of the audience questions? We have a few minutes for those. I see we have several.
Of course, and thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much to all of the panelists, and to really echo the remarks of some of the panelists and emphasizing the critical role that governments and civil society, of course, including faith-based organizations, and companies and organizations, you know, many of whom Tara and I have the privilege of working with, who are really deeply committed to addressing this global and really often invisible and pervasive challenge to identifying real effective solutions. So thank you so much all